Hi, I'm John Gibson. I'm the pastor of the priest at Grace Episcopal Church in Clayton, North Carolina. And it's my great pleasure today to be with Jack Bacheler, who attends a member of Grace. And Jack, I want to thank you before we start having our conversation today for all the wonderful work that you do with our garden and our plants outside. And I know there are other people involved in that. Pat, your wife, helps with that. Jill Allen, I think Diane Gorski, maybe some other people. But I would say that you're our lead gardener. And so I want to thank you and all the others too for your wonderful work, because I just personally like seeing all the wonderful plants and flowers. And I think that you guys always do such a great job with this. And before we talk about the reason for our conversation, because as you know, the Olympics are about to begin. And so you are a two-time Olympian, and many people at the church might not know that you competed in the 68 and the 72 Olympics. But since I started by talking about the garden, I also wanted to throw in there, because some folks might not know, that you won the giant pumpkin competition as well at the North Carolina State Fair. What was that, about 3 or 4 years ago? I can't remember now.
It was 2015. So
2015. Okay, a little longer than that. Yeah, time flies right along. So yeah, so you're a real competitor and a real winner in many ways. Jack, before we talk about your running career, and I'm just going to say I think it's a storied running career myself. I know you're a humble guy, and so you might disagree with that assessment, but I think you had a storied running career. I just wanted to ask you just kind of a question about it. We're about to start the Olympics. The Olympics are different this year, obviously, because of COVID. There will not be any spectators there, but do you have any thoughts or feelings every time this rolls around, every time an Olympics is about to start, since you were a competitor in 2 Olympics?
if you're going to have to edit this, John, because I wasn't sure whether you're talking about the distractions from the Olympics or you're talking about my impressions of being part of the Olympics.
Jack, it's whatever you want it to be, because there are every year I think there are distractions from the Olympics, and I think that distractions for, in my opinion, distractions for the participants. Of course, I'm not an Olympian, so I can't really say for sure, but it seems like every year there are distractions for the participants. And in part, I'm saying that because I read an article about Simone Biles, who is over in Japan right now, and she's just bored out of her gourd because all she can do is stay in her hotel room and then go to practice, and that's about all she can do at this time. Yeah. But I think also, aside from the distractions that participants like yourself must have to deal with in the lead up to the Olympics, there are distractions for other people as well, who are just who are viewers like myself. Obviously, there's been all the discussion about whether or not to have the games this year, and a lot of people have suggested that the games should be called off. So it seems like both are part of it. And so please speak to either or both of those.
Well, in the 68 Olympics, with the students being assassinated on the basis of protesting right before the games, and of course, when I was there in 72 in Munich, there was a terrorism thing. And although those were huge things and weighed on a lot of us fairly heavily, we're there as athletes also pretty focused. And really my thoughts, and the people who were certainly influenced by this, we're so focused on our races because we had spent parts of our lives doing nothing but, getting ready for an opportunity like this. The Olympics, I still remember more as the competition and what happened, and all the athletes, and being able to visit different venues. And as profound as some of those incidents were, recall also that a lot of the Olympics, at least when you're looking at a TV or something like that, were carried off beautifully. Now, this is certainly a different year, and I'm no more an expert than anybody else, with the COVID thing. And you probably know some athletes have begun to test positive with the Delta variant, uh, uh, already. So it's a pretty serious thing. I'm just hoping the protocols work to the extent that they can carry these things off, and hopefully in another 3 years, because we've been put off for a year, when the next Olympic rolls around, hopefully there won't be a pandemic. But I guess you can't rule out the possibility of one thing or another happening in 3 years. So
Mhm.
so for the most part, as a as a competitor, um, and given all the Olympics that have run off, uh, without a hitch, that's mostly what I take away from it.
Mhm, mhm. And so that's interesting and helpful to hear. So as a competitor, even though, and it seems like, oh, I'm just going to say every 3 or every 4 Olympics, there are some major events because the Olympics, they're a moment in which the whole world comes together, but also what's going on in the world can definitely affect the Olympics. Like this year, with
Yeah.
COVID, the Olympics are happening. They are a year late. There will be no spectators this year, but it is interesting to hear that as a competitor, and I imagine that's true for the competitors who are in Japan right now. They've got these things, they've got to deal with them, but they're very focused on their training, their preparation, and they're very focused on the events. And so I think that's an interesting thing to hear. And I guess, again, I'm not, I run, I exercise, but never been a competitor in any way. I ran track in high school, but certainly never a competitor at the level that you have been. You have to be very focused to get into the Olympics.
Yeah, so as a 20-year-old, I tried out for the '64 Olympic team in the steeplechase and didn't make that. But when you consider that was the beginning of serious running, then '68 came up, then '72 came up. It was the most important thing in my life, and probably a lot of other people, when you're running twice a day and running with folks and either competing in college or postgraduate running. Um, I shouldn't say that's all you thought about, because I was able to get my 3 degrees during that period of time, but it was certainly probably foremost. And there are other sports like swimming and gymnastics where you're putting in considerably more time and training. So it's at least for the time being, that's your life.
Hmm.
And I have some friends I used to run with. One of them is Jeff Galloway, and he developed this run walk approach to being able to complete long distances and has a huge following.
Hmm.
John Parker ran with us. He's the author of the best-selling running book called Once a Runner, a novel. And most of the people that I ran with that were pretty serious are in some way or another, with the exception of me, still involved in running in one form or another.
Hmm.
So for some of us, after the Olympics is over, that's pretty much it, right?
Hmm.
Um, so obviously you have to plan for a future,
Hmm.
but it's pretty all-consuming, and to be honest, maybe a little selfish. I
Hmm.
had a wife and 2 children, and yet I was probably spending 3.5 hours a day on running. So there is that part of it.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
Probably the people that are probably do a better job of spending more time with their families and maybe putting running in a greater perspective. I admire those people, but those are probably by and large not the people that make an Olympic team.
Hmm. And
So
and I was reading, so for people who are watching this, there's a Wikipedia page which talks about your life and mainly your running career. You came to running late. Today I think of somebody who competes in the Olympics as being involved in their particular sport from a very young age. But you were a tall guy and you played basketball. You didn't come to running until you were a senior in high school. How did that happen?
well, it was kind of strange. In Birmingham, Michigan, we had a big a big track and cross country program, a very well-known coach, Kermit Ambrose. And although I started in basketball during my junior and senior years, I was not very good. At 158 pounds and 6'6", I was not the most imposing but basketball player on the court. So I decided to try something else. So in the fall of my senior year, I talked to this Kermit Ambrose about coming out for cross country, and he tried his best to talk me out of it, saying, I can give you conditioning. Really what you need is jumping exercises and weightlifting and things like that, playing 3-on-3 basketball before the season. And I kind of persisted, and so he let me just try out. And we had about 75 people on the cross country team because he didn't turn anybody away. And the first time trial out of those number of people, I think I was fourth, never having run competitively before. And that was enough to get things started. And it started going better from there.
And it's really interesting too, because I don't think anyway, and again, I'm not somebody who has a lot of athletic experience other than as somebody who just exercises for fitness. I don't think of somebody that tall as being a long distance runner. I tend to think of people as being, you were a thin guy, but I tend to think of people as being shorter and perhaps somewhat emaciated, as being the ones who excel at the sport.
Yeah, that's true. I don't think I ever ran against anybody that was taller than me, and maybe annoyance isn't the right word, but I kept hearing, boy, with your long stride, boy, do you have an advantage. And then tell them to look in track and field news. You see the average Kenyans about 5'4", 5'5", and like 120 pounds. And here, they're world beaters because they're running like hummingbirds, real quick turnover and so on. But yeah, so I've always been a little self-conscious about that, but it seemed to work out okay.
Yeah, you did very well for yourself. I am reminded, and of course, he ran a very different event. Usain Bolt, also a very tall guy, but apparently in short distance, that long stride, like Michael Phelps is a big guy too. And apparently for swimming, for short distance, those things do make a difference. But again, I think for long distance, where every ounce matters, I think it's even more impressive that your career, well, you did very well in high school, even in just one season, and then you went to Miami of Ohio, so you got a scholarship there, and then you competed there. What was that like?
Well, so when you say scholarship, being third in the state, even though I just run for it, that doesn't get you a whole lot. So I had something called a grant and aid, which paid for about a third of your costs. And I worked 2 jobs as a freshman. I mean, it wasn't like I had to work 40 hours a week or something like that, but it's more like, I think 10 hours a week in one job and 10 hours a week in another job. One of them was answering bells, which you get a phone call and you had to go to the room and get the person that was being called. They'd come down to the lobby and answer the phone. Wow. The other was working in a library in periodicals. And it wasn't until my senior year where I got about 60% of the expenses paid. So we had to kind of earn what we were, in a small school like Miami of Ohio, we had a population of about 8,000 kids. And I think in track and field, at least, I don't think there are any, say, full scholarships, unlike basketball and football.
And you did extremely well, though, when you were at Miami. So you, and again, I'm reading this from your Wikipedia article. So you won the 3-mile run in the Mid-American Conference in 65 and 66, and you helped lead your team to the All-Ohio and the cross-country championship. And this is my cat, Donovan, who's decided to make a cameo during this. You broke the 3-mile, the school record at the time for the 3-mile run, and then you, goodness, my cat is just standing here right on the notes. So it's just the way it goes sometimes with this. Obviously, we're doing this live, and it's very informal. And so then you graduated in 66, you competed for the 64 you competed in the trials for the 64 Olympics that you didn't. And then you moved to Florida, where you began work on your doctorate. And it's from there, it was in Florida that you joined the Florida Track Club. And that became kind of a famous organization in the world of track and field.
Pretty well. Yeah, I was the Florida Track Club for a year and a half.
Okay.
And in other words, I wasn't saying that I was good. I was just the only one.
You're the only one. Yeah. You were there in the beginning. Let's put it that way. Yeah. But that track club would get, oh, and here's my other cat, Coco. So it's just going to be one of those days for all of this. So I'm going to put her down because, I told you before this, Jack, I mean, it just, whatever happens is what happens, and that's okay for these. It's very informal. So, but you ran with some incredible people down there. I think you mentioned Jeff Galloway. Also, Frank Shorter was in this team, and Frank Shorter won the marathon in the 72 Olympics.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We ended up being fortunate to, so by 72, it was pretty well known that altitude training was generally beneficial to distance running. And Frank Shorter and I went to Vail for 3 months before the 72 trials to run at 8,300 feet. And when you're in that situation, away from everything, running at altitude, running at times 3 times a day, our biggest week was 180 miles, by the way, but we averaged about 150 when we were up there, with the additional stress of being more difficult to run at altitude. That was a bonus. And Frank and I had trained together, since he was down with the Florida Track Club for about 2.5 years. So we were real competitive there. And then Jeff Galloway came up and joined us, although he stayed in a condominium. And one other person. So really, that was about as close to an ideal situation as one could probably have.
And getting back to what you were saying earlier, that's all you did. That was your focus. So, I mean, you weren't, you were in a doctoral program, but you weren't having to worry about that before all of this. This was long before the days of any online classes or anything. So you were just focused on running and getting ready for the 72 Olympics.
Yeah, I had graduated in the spring of 70, and we took an old Chevrolet Biscayne and drove to Vail, Colorado. And by that time, by late March, we're having some, say, 90, 95 degree days. So it was already getting kind of hot and humid in Gainesville. And the second day we were in Vail, we had 16 inches of snow.
Wow.
So that was a different situation.
Yeah, very different situation. I want to go back because you mentioned the hot and humid days, and apparently, even though you weren't training at altitude, according to this Wikipedia article, you were training in that heat and the humidity, getting ready for the 68 Olympics to make the team. And this article attributes you're making that team, and of course Mexico City is at altitude, so you're going to be running higher, where it is more difficult for people who are used to running at a lower altitude. But that heat and humidity actually helped you get ready for the 68 Olympics.
Yeah, so in a sense it did. Yeah, just because it was difficult and there was no getting around it. It wasn't as though you could run inside a air-conditioned house or store or something. So we were running outside. So on one hand, the altitude, once we got up to altitude, made things more difficult. On the other hand, the weather was perfect. And then again, like Vail, all you had to do is eat, sleep, and run. And so that was a good situation. Although your competitors, they took about the top 12 in each event qualified for high altitude training above Lake Tahoe. So it was an advantage for me, but it was an advantage for everybody who was up there, of course. And oddly, some folks ran better than others at altitude. Some people seemed to adapt better, and I was just in that fortunate group, I guess. But
you made the 68 team. Okay, excuse me. This is really going to be one of those. My cat just knocked over my water, so it's really going to be one of those. But like I said, it's going to be whatever happens is what happens. And he's really decided he's just going to be in everything today. So, but you made the team, you went to Mexico City, and you did very well in your heat. And so you qualified for the finals in the 5,000 meter, and you were the only American to qualify for the finals in the 5,000 meter, and you felt good about your running. But then you developed dysentery and you weren't able to run. You talked about the focus, the training necessary to compete at that level. I imagine that must have been quite a disappointment.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, and to give some perspective, again, by that time I was about 6'6" and maybe 158 to 160 pounds. If you can imagine a person in one afternoon and the following morning losing 10 pounds,
wow,
it's kind of hard. Well, maybe it's not a very pleasant image, but it's probably kind of hard to relate to. But I was pretty sick.
Yeah.
And then the next morning, I did try to warm up for the final. Yeah, but to be honest, I was pretty happy about making the final group of 12 or 16 or however many were in the finals of the 5,000 meters, because Track and Field News did not have me getting into the finals, so that was pretty good. But you're right, it was a disappointment. Maybe more so in retrospect, in that you're trying to figure out where you might have placed, and that's kind of frustrating because there's 3 or 4 people I'm sure I could have beaten, and now you're into the top 10, and then the fellow from Mexico, Mejia, finished 4th in the Olympics in the 5K, and I got to run against him in our national championships in Miami, Florida the following year on the track. And was able to beat him. So, I guess you always kind of wonder a little bit, but I guess you can't let, things like that, take too much importance.
Right. Yeah, quite impressive that you made the finals. Quite impressive to me that you exceeded expectations that people had for you. And then between the Olympics, so you continued to run, you continued to train, and between the Olympics, you won the National AAU Championships in cross country and the 10,000 meters in 69. You won the 6-mile run in 70. And also in 70, you ran the 5,000 meter race on the University of Florida track. That's your alma mater, where you got your master's and your doctorate. And you won in 13 minutes, 41 seconds. And that remains the track record for that event in Gainesville. And that's really quite impressive, I think, particularly when we also consider that training has come so far. There's so much more that people in sports know about nutrition, the best ways to train. So, and then you made the Olympic team again. This time you ran the marathon. And do you want to talk a little bit about that experience of running the marathon in the 72 Olympics?
Sure. So I had trained with Frank Schur for the previous year and a half, or almost 2 years, I guess. And we had trained at altitude. I would say we were, all impacted by the terrorist thing. And that day they put off the Olympics, it was partially to decide whether to go ahead with the Olympics. And I guess the decision that most people arrived at, and particularly the people actually, making the final decision, the officials and so on, International Olympic Committee, was that canceling the Olympics would have kind of like given in to the aims of the terrorists, right? But it was a little scary in that you didn't know whether this were the beginning of something or not, right? Whether everything would go better. I mean, fortunately, the rest of the Olympics went off well. But during the marathon itself, I think virtually everybody runs into a little bit of trouble during the marathon because it's not the easiest thing to do in the last, say, 6 miles or so for most people. And in my case, I wore some shoes that were too tight. And in the 2 weeks following the finish of the Munich marathon, I lost 9 of my 10 toenails.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I tend to be a 4-foot runner, so I come down on my 4-foot, which is a pretty fair amount of impact. And I remember the day after the marathon, our Kenny Moore placed 4th and Frank Shorter, of course, won. So we had the highest like team total, if you want to look at it like that any nation has had, putting 3 people in the top 10. But Frank Shorter and Kenny Moore went out for a run the morning after our competition. I took an early flight back to the United States, and I couldn't walk down the steps. I had to go down on my hind end and my feet and my hands, going down the steps and dragging my suitcase behind me. So that marathon pretty much beat me up. So another thing, if anybody's a State fan, they might recall that in 1974, they won the NCAA basketball championship, and they had a tall center by the name of Tommy Burleson. He was, depending on who you listen to, he was either 7'2" or 7'4". He was on my flight, and I was the next tallest guy, since a lot of the basketball players went on subsequent flights back to the United States. And we sat together, and they took out the seat in front of us.
Really?
So we ended up getting to know each other a little bit, and he talked to me. I didn't have a job at the time. He was telling me about NC State and how much he liked the Raleigh area, how nice the people were and stuff. And partially on the basis of that, I called a guy at NC State University because I found out there was a faculty job open, and just ended up going there as a postdoc. So anyway, it's kind of funny how things work.
That is kind of funny how things work. And you ended your running career, so to speak, when you went there. And just as a side note, I have to say about Tommy Burleson, I met him. And the only reason that I met him was he has a Christmas tree business.
Right,
and so for a while, I don't know if he still does, but for a while he had
I don't either. So we used to go over to Cary and buy Christmas trees from him, and he came down from the mountains. And
exactly, he had a lot on Kildare Farm Road, and I think there's a house there now. And so for a number of years, my wife and I went over there, and we met him a couple of times. And he is he's not just tall; he's a larger than life personality. But where I was going before that was that he, I mean, you did go to North Carolina State, you moved to the area, and we're all thankful for that. And you became a professor at North Carolina State University because you got your doctorate in entomology. And while you stopped running competitively, you continued in the running world, and you were training long distance runners at State. You want to talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, so we're really fortunate in that we had a really good women's team. There's Julie and Mary Shea and Betty Springs, and at one point in the national championship of maybe 200 runners, right? They finished first, second, and third in that big meet. And in Eugene, Oregon, Julie Shea, who I probably talked for an hour and a half about what Julie had accomplished when she ran here. She won the 10,000 meters, the 5,000 meters, and the 3,000 meters in one national championship meet. And fortunately, the women's team for the 2 years I was involved with them were national champions. So that was kind of neat.
Mhm.
And
And you weren't just involved with them, according to the Wikipedia article, you were their coach.
yeah, right.
Hmm.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
was a
yeah.
distance coach.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, and I didn't know, I have to say before we were talking beforehand. So at the time it was the AIAW, and that was
Yeah.
before women really became part, at least in running. Maybe perhaps it wasn't the case in other sports, but really became part of the NCAA system, and that was the highest competitive level for women running in cross country at this time. And you, as their coach and your team, you won the national championship twice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. After that, did you stop being involved with training runners? Did that pretty much bring your running involvement competitively in coaching
Pretty
to an
much.
end?
I'd say about maybe 2 years after that, um, I started like volunteering and just coaching people who were kind of weekend warriors,
Hmm.
all the way from someone who might run 20 or 25 minutes for a 5K on the roads to 5 of the athletes that ran with us were former college runners, and I coached them voluntarily. And in total, 5 of those runners made the Olympic trials in the marathon. So some of them were, were
Really?
fairly serious.
Wow.
That is, they completed their college eligibility, they had families and jobs, but they hadn't gotten the competitive, nature
Uh-huh.
urge just yet. So,
Right,
and
right.
that, and I probably did that for about 20 years or so,
Huh. Wow.
and then, gradually phased out of that. For one thing, if you're coaching, you're standing for 2 hours, and in my case, I have arthritis related things, and to stand for that amount of time kind of slowly became an issue. But for those
Mhm.
20 years, that was kind of fun.
Hmm.
Um, and some of the particularly some of the women runners, they had families and husbands and um, a beach to go to on the weekends. So
Mhm.
some of them were not. I shouldn't say I didn't care for it, but I was better suited to coach the guys and some of the women who were out every day, and I just met them twice a week, and they
Mhm.
did their other runs on their own. But that was a
Mhm.
that was a fun time.
Mhm. Jack, as you reflect back on your time competing, your time coaching, and as you think,
Mm.
again, the Olympics are about to start. Any closing reflections for us about running, or perhaps, I'm just kind of maybe going in a philosophical direction. Any life lessons that you learned from your experience competing or coaching?
Mm. I would say on one hand, if you compete at a pretty high level, um, to be honest, I think your wife and family suffers a little bit.
Mm,
Um, at least it certainly seems that way to me looking back on it. Um, it also kind of programs you for a certain fitness level. Um, you know how it is if you're training for something and you miss a few days, you kind of feel guilty about it. Well,
mhm,
that's particularly strong with somebody who's competed most of their lives. And
mm,
um, I'm not sure that with some of us that ever leaves you, because like
mhm,
when I started growing giant pumpkins, you find yourself immersed in that,
mhm,
almost completely. And there's a whole subculture of people that grow these things. So you get videos, you go on, you look at what other people have done, you do all this reading. And in my
mhm,
case, it was 7 days a week for 3 hours of bending over
mm,
for 5 months. And so I could my wife Pat probably wouldn't be the biggest fan of doing that again.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
my back wouldn't be a particularly big fan of that, but I find myself when I'm growing tomatoes. One year I was trying to grow the biggest tomato I could. Another year I was
Oh,
trying to see how many pounds of tomatoes I could get off of a single plant. That
mhm.
turned out to be about 90, by the way.
It's pretty
So,
impressive.
so maybe I'm not sure that's a good thing, but some of us
Mm-hmm.
are a little bit on the obsessive compulsive side about things. Well, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
healthy or not.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's interesting. I think it sounds like in part you are able to compete at such a high level because you have this drive, and it wasn't just part of running or coaching, in which again you were very successful, but also you see this drive in other areas of your life, and also somewhat, it seems to me, somewhat of a cautionary message as well, in the sense that and something for all of us to think about, because I think everybody has certain tendencies in their personality, and I certainly know it's true for myself. I think, and from a spiritual point of view, I remember one time my spiritual director telling me that every gift has a shadow side. And so for yourself, running, your drive is a gift. And obviously it's allowed you to achieve incredible things that most people do not achieve. At the same time, there can be a cost to those things.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. Well, Jack, I want to thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing some of this with us. For me, it's just been a real pleasure, especially as we are about to begin another Olympics. And so I just look forward to watching the Olympics and maybe getting some of your insights as these Olympic Games progress. You can kind of give me some insights into the 5,000 meter race or the marathon or some of the other races.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Thank you. This is enjoyable. And I just hope the Delta variant doesn't overtake the Olympics in the coming days.
Yeah, I hope not too. And my guess is, especially based upon what you said about the 72 Olympics, I think it's going to be a factor. It's going to be there. But my guess is that the games will go on in one way or another, and they'll be affected like the 72 Olympics were, or the 68 Olympics. But those games will go on, and I think kind of like 72, that's going to be a good thing.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully so. Yeah. All right. Well, Jack, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thank you, John. See you Sunday.
Okay. See you Sunday.